Good afternoon.
And we're starting off with the overall rates in terms of confirmed cases. As you can see on this graph, the numbers are now going up and going up really much more rapidly.
The test that we have for the virus does not tell us whether we have an active virus in a person. It's being called by the media a case.
And the UK has recorded almost 3,000 new cases of coronavirus.
The rise in the number of cases that we've seen today is concerning.
A case is when someone gets sick from a disease. That's completely different from a positive test.
It's not a case at all. It's just that we can detect that at some time in the past, perhaps, there has been viral infection, but it's probably been removed now.
Even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6, and if you do, you will be breaking the law.
It has what's been calculated as an infection fatality rate. That is, if you catch the infection, the probability of you dying is 0.3%. So that means that 99.7% of people survive. 80% of people who catch this virus will be completely asymptomatic. Those people who do catch the virus, many of them, the effect will be like a bad flu. Those people who are actually hospitalized, then we do have very good treatments for these.
And anyone breaking the rules risks being dispersed, fined, and possibly arrested. As your Prime Minister, I must do what is necessary to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives.
The test is called a RT-PCR test. It's otherwise known as a viral load test. And the test is a surrogate test. It was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who was given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for essentially inventing the technique of this test. And he said very specifically, you cannot use this test to either prove infectious etiology or to diagnose an infectious disease, which of course is interesting because if you can't use it to diagnose an infectious disease, that of course begs the question of what can you use it for? But let me back up here and describe what a surrogate test means, because this is very important to understanding the situation we're currently in. A surrogate test means that in a situation where you're trying to prove causation, you have to have a gold standard test. And those postulates, like with meningococcus, that is a gold standard test. It's reliable 100% of the time. You cannot use a surrogate test to prove anything. And that is what is happening with these tests. So what is the surrogate test? So remember that we don't have a gold standard. We don't have isolation, purification, reinfection. We don't have viremia. We don't have millions of copies demonstrated on an electron microscope. We essentially have no idea who has this coronavirus disease. So then they take a piece of one of the coronaviruses, the new one that they found. It has a new RNA sequence that hasn't been found before. They take one of the sequences, which they say is unique to that particular virus, and they do something called amplify it. And what that means is you take in your blood, you'll have one copy of this sequence, and it's too small, you can't find it. So you stimulate it, and this is what Kary Mullis came up with. You stimulate it, it makes 2 copies, that's 1 cycle. You make 4 copies, that's 2. You make 2 to the 20th copies, whatever number that is, that's 20 cycles. And what you find with this test is that once you put it through approximately 36 cycles, then you start to see the color change that tells you it's positive. So if you do 35 cycles, it's still too small to see. If you do 36, you start to see it, but you get false negatives, even though you don't really know which is a false negative because you don't have anything to compare it with. So then you do 37 and you see it, 5% of the time of people with these symptoms, and you say that's the number. But here's where it gets interesting. If you do it 40 times, you start seeing a lot more positives. And then here's something else to know. If you do it 60 times, so if you amplify it over and over and over again, it becomes positive with 100% of the people. Let me say that again. If you amplify it 60 times, it will be positive with everybody. That means that everybody has a piece of this RNA somewhere in their cells or in their genome or somewhere in their secretions. All you have to do is amplify it enough. And the problem is we don't know how many false positives or false negatives there are because we have nothing to compare it to. And if all biological tests have false positives, so if you test 30 million people and you have a 1% false positive rate, then 300,000 people by definition will test positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that the epidemic got better, all you have to do is lower the amplification cycles to 35, and then suddenly your vitamin C or your vaccine or your chloroquine or whatever you did worked, and now there's no more people testing positive. That is fraught with problems, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, with every country has their own standard of what kind of cycles they put it through, the number. So you see very different numbers coming out of very different places, depending on the number of amplification cycles that they're standardizing their test to. And I hope everybody is getting the point that this is a crazy situation.
Not just general testing and PCR testing, whether you should test asymptomatic people, just symptomatic, how many contacts. Dr. Bhattacharya, what is this asymptomatic testing with PCR? But particularly, I think one of the things that's been put out, the New York Times had an article about a month ago looking at some of the test results in New York and in, I believe, Nevada and Massachusetts. And they found that because the PCR tests are so sensitive, that up to 90% of the positives were not identifying live infectious virus. And then I think there's other studies that have come out. I know Oxford's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine says that if you have such high sensitivity, you cannot be there's no guarantee you're even identifying live virus. And I think that, I guess, one, just what does that mean for some of the testing and the case numbers that we see? But then two, it seems to me that if you're test positive with no symptoms with a very sensitive PCR test, and they can't even tell you if you're infectious, we're quarantining across the country probably hundreds of thousands or millions of people who aren't even contagious. And I think that obviously has a huge cost to society. Doesn't seem to be getting a lot of discussion, though.
The key thing about the PCR technology that I think is important for this discussion is that essentially you were doubling the genetic material if it's present, of the virus if it's present, right? If you have a very tiny amount of the virus, or if it's a viral fragment that's not actually that your body has successfully attacked, your immune system is successfully attacked, then what you're amplifying is something that's not going to pose any risk either to you or to others. So you're asymptomatic. The PCR is you're positive with the PCR. It's not a false positive in a technical sense, but in a functional sense, it's a false positive. Epidemiologically, it's a false positive, right? I'm not going to infect you, even though I have this even though I'm PCR positive, because it took so many doublings to reach the point that we can infer that there really wasn't very much genetic material for the virus present to begin with. I think that you're absolutely right to point out the cost of that when you attach it to a policy of contact tracing and isolation and quarantine. We effectively are quarantining people on the basis of PCR tests, a functional false positive PCR tests, where it will have no effect on disease spread because they're not infectious, and at the same time will impose enormous costs on them. Actually, there's another follow-on cost to that, is that it makes people less willing to cooperate with contact tracers because they know the costs. If I am contact traced and I'm asked to say who I've interacted with, I know if I say I interact with, with my friends, they're going to be facing the same thing. They might get quarantined, and if it's likely, it's possible that it's a false positive, a functional false positive, then I'm imposing cost on them for nothing. I think in LA County, I saw an LA Times story that 60% of people who are contacted, who put in touch with contact tracers, they won't cooperate with them. And you can see why. The cost of essentially ratting your friends out is enormous.
I ask this to Kerry. How do they misuse PCR to estimate all these supposed free viral RNAs that may or may not be there?
I think misuse PCR is not quite. I don't think you can misuse PCR. Actually. No, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But the real misuse of it is that you don't need to test for HIV. You don't need to test for the other 10,000 retroviruses that are unnamed also in the subject. See, somebody that's got HIV generally is going to have almost anything that you can test for because they have definitely been. HIV is a fairly rare virus. There's only 1 million of us out of 250, 300 million people in America that have that virus. So you have to get around, either your mother had to have it and pass it to you, or you have to really be paying a lot of attention to people that do have it and paying only attention to them and get a pretty good chance of getting it that way. It's hard to get it, but if you have it, there's a good chance you've also got a lot of other ones because you've been in the market for them. It's been possible for you to get a lot of. To test for that one and say that has any special meaning is what I think is the problem. Not that PCR has been misused. It's like. It's not an estimation. No, it's a really quantitative thing. It tells you something about nature and about what's there, but it allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable, and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important. See, that's not a misuse. That's just sort of a misinterpretation. It is. No, there's very little of what they call HIV, and what's been brought out here by Philpott and Isai already. The measurement for it is not exact at all. It's not as good as our measurement for things like apples. An apple is an apple. You know, you can get something that's kind of like, if you got enough things that look kind of like an apple and you stick them all together, you might think it's an apple. But and HIV is like that. Those tests are all based on things that are invisible, and the results are inferred in a sense. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that. That's what it's not.